What we're going to do is finish up the discussion on cognitive aging and then talk a little bit about everyday functioning and end with a discussion of the article that you guys reviewed for class, because I think there's a lot of important information kind of pulling a lot of the work that we've been talking about together. So we talked a lot about changes in things like attention and memory and overall intellectual abilities. We have a couple of different areas that we typically assess in a neuropsychological evaluation that I briefly want to talk about in terms of the aging process. So one of those is visual spatial abilities. And here are some typical tests that we might give in a clinical evaluation to look at these types of skills. So we might give people some blocks that have different shapes on each side, and they have to quickly put them into a pattern that we show them. And this tests a lot of different abilities, but one of them is that visual spatial manipulation. And these sorts of tests, we do see declines as people age. Now, one of the questions that people have asked is, are these tests more sensitive to aging processes, or are they simply more complex than some of our verbal tests that we may give individuals? But we do see that these sort of tests are challenging for older adults. So in terms of implications for technology development, what sort of implications do these sort of things have in terms of technologies that you might be thinking about for older adults, or how you might be designing them? Okay, so making maybe the face of it very straightforward, not involving them to kind of mentally manipulate information. If you're designing a game, maybe keeping this in mind for older adults, because something that requires a lot of mental manipulation could be frustrating, but at the same time, it also could be challenging too, right? So it might actually help develop some of those skills. So again, kind of, thinking about the pros and cons, but definitely probably for the face of something, you don't want something that's going to require a lot of mental manipulation on their part. Okay, so executive abilities, these are kind of the highest order, the problem solving, the reasoning, the goal setting. When we talked earlier about changes in the frontal area of the brain and the frontal aging hypothesis, that really comes from the idea of seeing that these sort of cognitive skills show the greatest decline with age. So our ability to do things like problem solve and plan or figure out patterns like this are some of the types of cognitive skills that show significant changes. Other sorts of descriptions for executive abilities include things like reduced abstract thought, so very concrete thinking, decreased cognitive flexibility, decreased judgment and decision making. And again, these are the types of tests where we do tend to see those great age-related changes. So ways that we can look at executive functioning with age, this is an example of our trail making test where we have individuals switch back and forth between letters and numbers. So they have to do like 1A, 2B. And this test, you can see, does involve mental flexibility, so you have to keep going back and forth, but it also involves visual spatial scanning, speeded processing, and in our data, we have found that this test actually correlates very well with how people are doing in their everyday world, in their everyday functioning, in terms of both questionnaires and some of our performance-based measures. Here's another type of executive functioning test, and probably you guys have seen different sorts of ways of showing this, but this is one where you give people a pattern and you give them some of these balls, and what they have to do is, by the fewest movements, try and get to the goal position. And as the task gets harder, you can see that this frontal area of the brain starts to light up more. But you can also see that there's other areas of the brain that are involved in this sort of task. And this is really one of the issues with most of the clinical tests that we use to assess executive functioning, is that by definition, when you're talking about this higher order functioning, you have to pull on other brain areas, right? So you have to be able to see the stimuli, manipulate, work with the stimuli in some sort of way, maybe it's motoric. So it's going to involve other functions as well as that executive ability. Okay, so other important aspects of memory that also are thought to be related more to the prefrontal area, and which our data suggests may actually affect people in their everyday life more than just recalling things like what they had for breakfast or a story that we might give them, are temporal order memory. So here that's kind of the sequencing, the ability to remember kind of I went to the store before I got to work. Or in our data, we show temporal order memory to be linked highly with things like cooking. And so if you think about cooking or making a complex recipe, that involves a lot of timing of different events. Source memory, so your memory for specific events. So for example, I learned or I got information about how to take medications from my doctor versus I saw it on TV. Being able to make that distinction and make sure that you're using the information that's most important. We found that source memory actually shows some correlation with people's social functioning. And I think that one way that this makes sense is the fact, or I don't know, how many of you have ever experienced going up to someone and telling them a story and then having them say, yeah, I told you that. So, you know, if you think about that, if you've got someone with memory problems and they experience that on a number of occasions, it might be something that they start to retreat from those social interactions. And then prospective memory, our ability to remember to do things in the future. And we've seen prospective memory being highly linked with medication management and medication abilities. And these types of memory are thought to be related to kind of that frontal area of the brain. One of the ways that we've been testing this is through what we call an activity memory paradigm. And what we do is we have individuals do different tests in the laboratory, and we tell them that at the end of the test, we're going to give them this task challenge rating, and that's their cue to remember to ask us for some medication that their friend needs. So the prospective memory test is being able to remember when they see a cue that they need to ask for this medication. At the end of the 10 different tests that are involved, we then ask them to recall the 10 different activities that we gave them. And then we show them, we have cards that has a description of each of the tasks, and we ask them to put them in the temporal order that they did the activities. And this way we can test a number of different concepts related to memory. And we can see that all of these different concepts show some age-related changes. So here are performances from our 20 to 24-year-olds across the different tasks. And you can see that a correlation being 1, they get them all correct. You can see that our younger adults are doing fairly well, and our older adults, the correlation is about 0.62. So this temporal order, we see some significant changes in that across the aging process. Prospective memory, our younger adults are almost remembering all the time, so they're pretty much at ceiling there, with 10 being correct. By the time we're 80 plus, we're forgetting at least 2 times to ask for that medication. And then you can see the recall where the younger adults are recalling between 8 to 9 of the tasks that they were asked to do, the 80 plus about 6 tasks. So again, we see changes not only in just this recall of information, but in these other aspects of memory. And our data is suggesting that these other aspects of memory are really important for how people maintain their independence in terms of functioning in their everyday lives. Okay, so technology development, what sort of implications do you think some of these executive functioning, reasoning sort of changes might have for design? Okay, so definitely the prospective memory, the use of reminders to support older adults so that hopefully they can make those appointments or initiate those activities, especially as we see some significant changes with things like dementia. Good. Okay, so very good. Some sort of help, the importance of help. And we're actually just with a digital memory notebook. We've been talking about that recently and how important that is and what's going to be the best way to communicate that help. And we also see that with the robotics project, right? We're talking about those visual spatial changes, and we were talking about what's going to be the best way to show someone how to use an item, like what sort of, viewpoint are they going to need that's going to make that least difficult for them. Okay, so same thing like that working memory, holding things online, like that temporal memory, making sure that there's not too much information that you're going to expect them to track or be able to provide that support to assist them in doing so. And I think in the article that you read for class, it was really clear that we need to be thinking about these things when we're designing for older adults, right? Otherwise, we're not going to have technologies that are going to be useful for this population. So language, the last area that we haven't talked significantly about, when we talked about general intelligence, we saw that vocabulary, that crystallized ability remains well intact with only slight decline, but not until the late decades, right? Now, there are some other sorts of language problems, word retrieval, that's probably the biggest complaint of older adults. So if I'm working with an older adult and I ask how their memory is, and they tell me, I'm experiencing significant difficulties recalling words and recalling people's names, I think normal aging. So that is the most common complaint that we hear about normal aging, that people are having difficulty with this retrieval. And we talked about those executive and those memory, the strategic processing, right, of being able to go in and pull out that information. So it may not be that that's language per se, but it may be being able to retrieve, or those memory skills, bringing that information back out. And we do see some more of that tip of the tongue, knowing that word you want to use, but not being able to get to that word. Some other changes that we see are changes in verbal fluency. So if I gave you, say, a category and I told you to tell me as many words as you could think of that belong to that category or that started with a certain word. But again, is that really language, or is it more some of those strategies that we use to go in and quickly produce and retrieve that verbal information? And then complex sentence comprehension. So if I gave you a very complex sentence that had a lot of knots in it, and you had to really hold a lot of that information online, again, is that language ability, or is it working memory, having to keep information active online while you're translating a very complex sentence? So in general, in terms of that semantic knowledge, that seems to remain relatively intact. So what sort of implications does this then have for technology development? Okay, because we certainly know that they can make use of these intact semantic skills, right? So if there's ways to encourage more use of those skills with cues or other sorts of things, then that might be a good way to think about things. Okay, good. So do some of the skills affect different languages? I would say yes, depending on how the language is formulated. So like in German, my guess is that working memory difficulties would actually show, maybe be greater for language, but it could be that because of the language, people have developed better working memory skills over their lifetime, which may then negate some of those. So it would be an interesting question to probably look at, and I don't know the literature, but I would say that these age-related changes, are ubiquitous in things like speeded processing and working memory, and we do have to keep in mind that some of those could actually affect some of the other changes that we're seeing, so they could be the underlying cause of the changes. In fact, some hypotheses are that the changes that we see in aging are all related to speeded processing. And so, for example, memory difficulties occur because we can't process information as quickly. Or some people have argued it's not speeded processing, but it's actually working memory. So there are different theories that people have come up with that try to explain kind of a lot of these cognitive deficits that we're seeing as part of the aging process.